Hi, Maddie. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, Michelle, a couple episodes ago, we introduced FLL, my grand strategy for all college admissions. Today, we're going more in depth on, I guess, one of the cornerstones of that concept, which is backing up your major. We're going to talk about one of the really the key aspects of how you make a coherent college application and do so in a way that'll be effective to getting in. Ready to hear?
Awesome. Can't wait to get started.
Let's do it. Welcome back, everybody. So last time I brought up FLL. If you haven't heard that episode, I recommend you check it out. It's really important for everything that's going to be going on. I'm going to be talking, it really is my grand strategy, and I laid out almost the basics of it or kind of the theory behind it. But if you don't want to know, it's basically, I believe in a genuine effing, if you will, love of learning and academic application of what you've learned. There's a lot more to it than just like the idea. I worry that a lot of students are just going to run out and be like, I love learning over and over and over again. And there's a lot, it really is a strategy. So I've talked about like the overarching ideas about it, but there's a lot more to how I should make it work. And that all begins with the idea of majors. Michelle, this is not really a trick question. I don't know if you know, when I'm working with a student, when I'm working on their application, what is my number one goal of their application? Specifically when I have the admissions team reading their application, like what do I want them to know about the student or pick up?
Is that you want them to be able to figure out like what their major is or what their interests are?
Sort of, yeah. That's close. Yeah, so like C plus, I guess. It's not that I want my student. I certainly don't want them to be like overcome with emotion with what wonderful people they are. Like that's like they're tiny goals or what have you. And it's not that I want them to like make a connection. No, I want when admissions reader or team reads my student's application for them to have a very clear idea of what that student's role will be on campus. And role means a lot of different things, I suppose. But that's how I actually view admissions, how students actually do or do not get it, like what fit is, if you will. It's not so much about like, oh, this kid is really nice or what have you. It's about like what will they actually be doing here. And yeah, that's where I think you can fall into the trap of like, well, we want students that are like pandering's strong, but like trying to do emotions, or I talked about this in the FLL episode, trying to fill in holes or stuff where it's like, I'm the bravest student or I'm the nicest student or whatever. That kind of makes sense, but I feel like that's kind of a trap because that's not really how these people think. Like this is a business, and that's something I'll talk about more.
Right.
Instead, logistics is really what I view. My cat is currently sitting on my Street Fighter controller, and if she hits the wrong button, the game will start. So I'm sorry. Hey Penny. But basically, logistics are key. Like these are very much companies that are trying to fill very expensive slots in a very expensive campus. And well, what are the logistics of a college campus? Like, what do they actually have? And what's mostly is their academic departments. They have your English department, your science department, STEM. Like that is what's actually like that's what they're paying for. Honestly, a lot of teachers and faculty and buildings stuff like that. So it makes sense that, like that's what they need to fill, and they only have so many slots in all these different departments. So it stands to reason they're going to have to be pretty practical when actually letting students in, that those slots are evenly filled. And I think everyone reading this, it'll make enough sense with the idea of like computer science is harder to get into than other majors. Engineering is more difficult. Not that much more difficult in my experience, but it is. And well, why is that? Like if college is really just this magical bastion where you do whatever you want, and that's because they're like it's supply and demand, right? Like there are more people who want to do computer science than there are slots available. And in particular, like these schools don't really want to forego their English department or their history department or whatever, even if they're not as popular.
Right.
And that like this idea where it's like these are businesses trying to like billion-dollar empires, really, some of these trying to fill these very particular classes and courses and clubs, and they have speakers come, like it's all about money and getting things filled. It's not all money. It's just like having these things actually be used. That like every time they have some grand laureate poet come, they want people to be there. Like they need people to be there.
Right. So their priorities kind of shift too, depending on the landscape.
Sure. And yeah, at some point we'll talk about institutional priorities. I believe those are, yes, in a micro sense, that's absolutely true. In a macro sense, schools, like college is college. like it's like
Right.
institutional priorities like deserves its own like discussion because that on a micro sense absolutely like but I don't know how much that actually affects your year to year admissions team because yeah, you might have a really famous poet coming next year, but is that really going to change who you let in to like Stanford this year? I don't think it moves the needle in that regard. Um, okay, but I do have a thought experiment for you, and this is kind of what leads to me about like, all right, well, how do you do that, right? So now like this is what I'm trying to get across with students in their application is like the role they will fill. And I already talked about that. Just talking about like your personality traits or values or what have you is kind of a weak way to do so when these schools are really interested in making sure they have butts and seats for different programs, stuff like that. I guess I'll begin I have a thought experiment. So you are now, congratulations, Michelle. I was waiting to compliment you. You are now an admissions officer. You're not an admissions reader. You're an admissions officer at a highly prestigious liberal arts college, which is
Okay, pressure's on.
one of my favorite lines I read online a lot. Okay, this is a theoretical. It's a very small liberal arts college. You take 2 students. Um, it's one basically. You know that there's like a math department and like a physics department, and you only get to take 2 students. 3 students apply. So like struggling here in 2024, like it's but like you're marketing. One of them is like a math specialist. Literally all they write about is math.
Mhm.
No, they have math and they're qualified. They have the stuff. The other is a physics specialist, and all they write about is physics. And that's all they care about. And there's a third who's some combination of math and physics, and also writes about I don't know, like a choice encounter with a homeless man and what it taught them about life.
Okay.
It's always the homeless man. Well, you have to make a tough choice where 2 of these kids get in. Which 2 do you think you would accept?
Oh my gosh, this is hard. I mean, I guess my initial thought is I'd take the math one to fill a math seat and the physics one to take the physics seat, but I don't think it's that
No,
simple.
it's that simple. It's a thought experiment. It's
Okay.
it's it's, it's that oversimplified. Yeah, that at its like corest level, deepest, tiniest level is the best way I can describe my mindset while applying to schools. And I'm sure you and a lot of others reading this might know about like the spiky versus well-rounded debate.
Right. Yep.
And this is a little tangential. Basically, I do get why spiky is like a good methodology for college admissions, if only so far as it accidentally checks a bunch of boxes that these schools are looking for anyways. Like I don't think it's as simple as the fact that it's like, oh, they're spiky. They only love 13th century like French literature. Like, welcome to college. Like
Right.
I think that may have been true before my era, which is like 2015 or so. But as I always joke, like these schools don't like when people find out what the game is and they kind of shuffle the deck. And
Yep.
the other is I think they got pretty goddamn sick of students applying for 13th century poetry and writing about, all this other stuff. Then they show up and they ask where the computer lab is.
Right, right.
And I was like, poetry? I love being at Stanford though. That's I think the combination of why like being spiky is not going to be. I'm not going to be preaching that as one of my big ideas. However, the opposite of spiky is like well-rounded, and I believe the line between well-rounded and like unfocused can happen pretty easily, and that's what I think students want to be avoiding. Like you don't want to be
Interesting.
everything, and the line is like these schools want a group of specialists that make up a diverse class. Like that is closer to true than not. Like they are looking for different people who are doing different things, if only to go back to my original idea that someone who's really interested in 13th century poetry is going to be very easy to slot into all the weird 13th century poets they have come talking or historical. That'd be
Right.
it'd be very impressive if they had 13th century poets
Yeah.
on deck. But historians that are going to be talking about it, like it leads back to a much colder, more logical understanding of how these slots are actually being filled. And how do you do that? So that is why I believe the easiest way to build a coherent, effective application is by focusing upon your major. Full stop. Like that, like for students wondering is like, how do you actually build an application? Think about, and here's how I guess how you do that is, well, first you got to pick a major, and that's probably the first thing I ask students. It's actually on my form for students to submit to work with me. Is like, what major do you want to apply? And to students' credit, they tend to know. I think that this advice like isn't going to be earth shattering because I get the impression that most students understand that having the extracurricular game has come a long way in the last decade. And students and families seem to understand the value of picking a major ahead of time and having a dedicated body of proof
That's
regarding it.
true.
And
Mhm.
I'm sure that's what you found. You see these kids' resumes and it makes sense. But
Right.
No matter where you are in the process, is like I do recommend you consider what, like, pretty much know what major you will at least be applying to college with. And if you're not sure or you're undecided or what have you, I wrote here, it's like choose the major that is best supported by your extracurricular background. So that may or may not be what you actually do in college. Like the reality is when you get to private schools, at least you're allowed to do whatever you want, and that's why I joked about the 13th century poet who is now works at Google. It's 2015. That's how mine works out. They basically, it's like this sounds like it come off as like strategic positioning or like lying or what have you, but it tends not to really feel that way. It's like when students bring me like a big math application, I'm like, you should apply math. Or
Mm-hmm.
more likely when students bring me, like tons of art and a little bit of computer science, I go like, you should probably apply art or like game dev or some sort of media creation
Right.
because then you is actually backed up. And I guess I'll get to. I'm building up to it. I put it's easiest 312 at the end. That's my favorite part of this whole thing, but I'll get to it. There's a couple caveats here. One is a public school caveat. So this is good for the podcast. I believe the biggest irony of all of college admissions is that private schools want you to write deeply about your passions and be spiky and have like dedication to a certain academic craft
Yeah.
so that once you get there you could do whatever you want. So state schools want you to be like well-rounded and show like the UCs like very much by design and show a wide array of interest and subject matter so that you are locked into the major you pick forever when you get there.
Right. Yeah.
And that is, I believe, the single like weirdest, best irony of this whole process. State schools, you are much more locked into the major you choose to do, and that is why whenever I am a little bit more creative, if you will, with students, it almost always is when they want to do computer science. However, they lack a strong computer science background to kind of like back that up. In which case, if you remember, I don't want to dox the kid, but a wonderful young man who wrote about he wrote about business stuff for all his private schools. It was last year. Wrote about
Yes.
private
Yes.
schools.
Okay.
He's the man. Love you, boy. How's you going?
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, we wrote about business stuff, which is what he had backed up. Like, and
Right.
I'm having this conversation with him. Was like, right, I understand you want to be doing computer science, but like, you're not going to get in for that kind of stuff. So like, and he had a fairly strong business background. So we wrote about business. Like, computer science never comes up. But then we do the state schools, Georgia Tech, the UCs, Michigan, and it's just you basically have to do the application again. It's like you would basically
Yeah.
just do, now he is a computer science lad who loves game development, and like that's okay for students at home is to be a different person in different schools. Like it's more work. Like that's how I see it, and it works better than it probably should. Like I am not my whole strategy is my strategy is not turning every student into like a farmer or a 13th century poet. Like that style
Yeah.
of strategic positioning I believe is both outdated, way more trouble than it's worth, and also I think really kind of nasty. Like I don't like making students lie about like everything should be backed up by your extracurriculars in the first place. So
Yeah.
and that's interesting me and like going too far with this as I see it.
And you want them to feel authentic too.
Yeah. I don't know if this is probably more of a tangent, but it's also so important you have these extracurriculars because when actually do it like we'll get to the actual essay stuff. Yeah, we'll finish with the essay stuff, how this all comes together actually in the application. Another caveat though about how like pick the major by your background is don't literally only write about your major. And I've learned from writing and like talking with students is I always have to have caveats like this. And I'm like, here's a really good idea. Here's how I do it. You don't use like a sledgehammer when like a big hammer will do. Although I was thinking about it, Michelle, if someone literally just wrote about their major, it's like
Yeah.
they're applying math and their personal statement's about math and there's something about math, and my school's about math, and the extracurriculars are all about math and their math and the stuff is good. Like that's not the best application, but that charts pretty well, I think. Like
Yeah.
they're not going to be like distraught or like horrified with their results. I don't know if it would work at the top level because it's just like too much. But especially if like those essays were different, if there are different aspects of your life that involve math, like,
Right.
but that's not a good idea. It's more that we'll get to what the goal should be in the 312 parts. Like, and then one last caveat is probably just as important as backing up your major is don't back up not your major. And this one I really want to emphasize. And this is something that I probably of this whole this whole episode, I think the most students might find beneficial and notable is if you are not applying music or art, I do not recommend writing many essays about music and or art. Similarly, if you have essays, if you're applying physics, I remember I met one student just for like a one-off session, and his Yale application, he had an essay about like helping his friends study for a test. I think I didn't think I was in love with the essay, but it was okay. But it was about like a history test. And I basically was like, "Can you make this a physics test?" And he's like, "Why?" It's like, "Because you're applying physics, so it should be a physics test." And it sounds reductive, but that's kind of the idea, is that you are applying to be, let's say, a physicist for these schools. Like it should be very obvious that like your dedication and your passion is to physics overall. And that often involves like just making things physicsy, if you will, like one way or
Mhm.
another, little things. But it's much more is this one. It goes back to like I've taken L's on this. It's like if you're not applying music or not applying art, you shouldn't write essays about like you're interested in music and art,
Right.
because they're being logical regarding like letting students in to like fill different needs at their school. And they have needs for musicians and or artists, like they really
Right.
do. However, those are being filled by the students who have been accepted into the music and or art programs. And like that's where you run into trouble. If you are suddenly trying to say I'm a physicist but also love art, like they don't have those slots for you. Like that's not what they need. They don't need a
Mhm.
physicist who loves art. They need a physicist who loves physics and maybe some math and maybe some stuff that would make sense kind of in that food group of physics. Whereas all the art and music stuff, they very much have those paid out for the students who are in those programs. Similarly, is I don't recommend it, like if we're talking about like themes of applications, I don't recommend your theme be anything that's not your major,
Right.
because I think that's what students will end up doing, is like, well, I'm going to theme this around how I overcome adversity or how I'm courageous or what have you. And
Mhm.
that's a completely different strategy. And I understand the mindset behind that. I think just when it actually comes time to have your file reviewed, it I'm not sure they'll catch on to it unless you're really blunt about like how like a certain personality trait. And B, that doesn't, we go back to the logic here, like they don't have a slot dedicated. They don't have like a brave person department. They have a physics
Right. It's
department.
harder for them to define your
Yeah.
role.
Yeah. You force them to try to, yes, correct. You force them to try to define like not what your role might be as like a person or what have you, but also like I don't know, what does a brave person act like in college? But you really force them into a whole of like well, okay, but they're applying. It says here they're applying like advanced calculus and they don't have any math stuff here. Like, it doesn't make any sense. You know, like I
Mhm.
like are they going to be succeeding in these, like, we want kids in our advanced class. We brought in this Russian guy who's like $1 billion a year. He's like he's teaching 3 students. Like, are they gonna make stuff like that? Those are the real conversations these schools are having.
Right.
It's not. It's much more that and much less like, oh, the story of, oh, I love this child. It's like it's just not how it works. These are factories that have to drill down and accept thousands of students over tens or more thousands of applicants. And they don't have the ability to do it. Like they have to stick to logic of of basically money of like what are we paying for? Like what needs to be filled. And then I just added sports here, and I think we're gonna do a sports essay soon enough, anyways.
I was totally just gonna ask you about that. Like, where do sports?
Sports is not a major.
Yeah, yeah.
And the short version of this is like, unless you're playing sports, in which case we'll save this one. We need to do a sports essay. But the short version is if you're not playing sports, you really shouldn't write about sports because it's not a major, and they don't like that's not a rule. Those rules again are filled, but by athletes.
Right.
And if you are an athlete, spoiler, you still shouldn't write that much about sports. But like why is more complicated. So I hope I've convinced everyone the importance of backing up a major. It's like, now, how do you actually build an application with that information? Like, okay, I have like you picked one, it's logical. And Michelle, it's as easy as 3-1-2.
3-1-2. Okay.
Yeah, I say this during consultations and then I just overwhelm the family. So I'm gonna try to go through it slow. So now you're like, how do you theme an application? What is the process? I start with 3, which is kind of what do you want to do with your life? So I'm talking to a theoretical student. Like when you grow up, as I say, why you care about this major? And I using myself as an example. When I was applying to college, I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to be a comedy writer. And I wanted to basically be a digital media comedy writer, like all the bloggers I read that
Hmm.
like were my heroes. So
Mhm.
that's my version of 3. And yeah, like, your version will likely be slightly different than the dreams of a 2009 millennial goofball. But like, and that, so you could, yeah, and feel free to students sit and think about it. It's like, well, why it doesn't have to be like a job. It could just be like related to your academic major. Why do you want this to be your major in the first place? Like, what would your goals be? why is it worth 4 years of your application? And that could be a lot of things. It could be like you want to go to academia, you want to there's and niches are good. It's like there's an aspect. It's like me. I want to be an English major for a very niche reason. Like my goals are very specified and niche, and that's more helpful than not. So you come up with that. Now one is proof, and this is where a lot of the stuff in your application comes in. Proof of really two things. And this comes from extracurriculars and your essays, basically. Your application is proof of that 3 is real. And it's proof of two things. One is that you know you're talking about. So in high school, I wrote for the school newspaper and wrote funny things. I wrote for a website called crack.com. I used to always put jokes in my essays, even when I wasn't supposed to, and teachers never knew what to do about it. And like that's the stuff that I could write about and detail. And that's to be like that may sound familiar. This like one is a lot of the essay work I do with students. I do extracurricular style essays.
Right.
And that's proof of one thing is that like you it makes sense that you would want something that's so niche and possibly and it could and like what you want could be pretty what's the word I'm looking for ambitious. That's fine. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And it can be a specified or niche, but like but it needs to be backed up by these series of essays that are not just like explaining where you come from, but also providing evidence that like your ultimate goal, which you will address somewhere in your application, you know, you find it, like makes sense or is intuitive. That's like what you're talking about. Like just me writing those essays, I think it'll be intuitive. It's like, well, this guy obviously likes writing and like wants to be funny.
Right.
But the other thing you're trying to show proof of is that through your actions and your successes, and that it's not just that you know what you want to do, it is apparent that you will, or obvious that you will get there, that you have the goods one way or another to actually succeed in your ambitious goals. Because like at least so far in your high school career, you have put the work in and had achievements that are both like genuinely impressive in their own merit, but also tailor themselves to you continuing on to the school. Like the ramp has begun.
You're on the path. Yeah.
And you're doing well. So that's one. Now there's 2, which is you have 3, which is what you want. 1 proof. 2 is how every school you apply to gets you from 1 to 3. And that's the cool part. And that's where, honestly, a lot of the stuff you do comes in. It's like the white school stuff.
Right.
The whole white school stuff is very much based around having those 2 factors defined in other essays. That the reader, either inherently or because you just told them, knows like what you want to do with this major, what your interests are. You mentioned in the white school, they also know what else they've read about you. It is much more logical and helpful to then try to be like, okay, so how is Duke or Stanford or Michigan or whatever? How is this school going to offer me resources or abilities that will, continue that path? It's all about a path.
Yeah, exactly.
And when read, it often just goes like, oh, this is really good. I like the kid. He'd be a fun comedy writer.
Yeah.
But like, I think I did a good job with the 3-1-2 thing. Is like that path really is kind of how I see this process. It is about creating a logical, cohesive overall application that explains like that's mostly what it's supposed to get across. Because then when it's time for the mission team, and like then you have space to be fun and like write about the homeless man. It's always the homeless man. There's like it's
right. Of course.
Homeless man and like waiting in line at the In-N-Out. The 2 essays that I just don't do.
Oh my gosh.
All my best ideas come to me when I'm in line at the In-N-Out. Yeah, like that. I hope people listen to that is like, oh yeah, that does make sense. That doesn't seem like crazy. It's not like in practice, it shouldn't feel so mechanical. It's like that is an overall mindset. But it requires going into this process kind of with like an overall FLL mindset. It's like I want to talk about academic subjects that inspire me, as well as a general plan of how to put all that stuff in order and like what you want to make sure it gets across. And that can be somewhat implied, but I also recommend students is like often just like putting it in front of their face, like straight up saying is, like my goal is this, that's what I want to become to the school. That can be very helpful because you don't want to give these readers too much credit for like skimming.
Right.
Especially when it comes to the white school stuff. Don't be worried about like being very upfront about like what your goals are, and then probably how the school will help you get there. Probably 1 can be more like into it. Probably the majority of work is in that 1. It's like writing about I write about the past and what students have done by a pretty good majority, and it's almost always related to the extracurriculars that as it relates to their future major. And that's how okay, so now you have a big idea. That's why if you're working on essays right now, getting started, what have you, it's like usually you want to start with your resume as a beginning. And I recommend students create a resume. I know our students, when they're signing up, they work with you and build a resume. And I know how helpful that is.
Yeah.
I worked through it very extensively until I basically memorized it. I will say, like, if there's one critique I found of like my own work with students, like, and like they get in, so I don't care. But but I would say that like eventually soon children, I will start showcasing essays from real life students that we have worked with. And I think one people will notice, not a critique, just notice, is like I am extremely extracurricular focused on the essays. Almost all essays I do with students in college applications are related to extracurriculars they have accomplished, and it is related to like what they did, what they liked about it, and like what it means going forward. And I guess why don't I write about the homeless man or the in and out or the creative, the more just like, because like I'll read about that's like, don't write about extracurriculars. That's just like, no, dude, you have to. Like, what else would you write about? You're applying to college. It's mostly because I've found over and over, you absolutely can get in all the other aspects of this conversation, which we'll get to at some point. You know, it's like the motivations and like the character stuff. Quite honestly, when I'm working with students, I openly tell them that's not my focus when I'm building essays with them. Like, I'm not focusing on like how does the student come off? How do they like what is the theme, the personality theme of this essay? Or like, and maybe because that's not how I write or that's not how I see it. I believe in telling a good story the best way possible and trying to convey a message that you want to convey. And both in my own writing, but also with students, I found over and over and over again that a good story told well, that is genuine and actually is like what they believe, their personality does shine through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised at first, but it's just I don't even really worry or think about it. Is like telling a good story that is cohesive and kind of falls into this narrative of like why they love learning and what they want to do with that information. They tend to come off as good kids.
Yes.
They tend to come off as good people. And I think a lot of it is because I tend to work with good kids, good people, and who do love learning, you know, or they like it or have you. And like that, it's not that crazy. So like that's probably a big reason why I'm so in favor of like but also like this aspect of how to build an application in the first place, because I've just done it over and over and over again. And not only does it work well for all the stuff I talked about, it also seems to get across the type of other events I think a lot of students are thinking are the most important, like those character personality traits and value systems, stuff like that.
Right.
Those simply seem to find their way in. And maybe when working on your own, you might need to be more cognizant to make sure those get in. But I found they just kind of show up when writing passionately about the stuff you've done. If only because, well, what are you but like defined by the work you have done and what it means.
So true.
I think that is a perfectly valid way, not just for college applications, but like that is, I think, the way I see a lot of other people, like good or bad, is like, well, what actions have you done? Like, what work have you done? Like, that's often how I'm interested. That's what I'm most interested in, I guess. And like, it's not crazy to believe that you can take character traits and stuff, everything from that, from such a part of their life. Okay, this is a good one. I think I'll continue on the FLL principles as I can do these. The next one is actually, I'll just do it. It's pretend your admissions reader is a 21-year-old white woman who wants to be a lawyer.
Oh my gosh.
And that one will get more into the kind of the mindset of writing, where it's about, I don't want to spoil too much of it, but it's basically about the ideas that you have no idea who's going to read these, but getting into the mindset of the theoretical reader, why that's important. And I'll get real pretentious. I might introduce a new hat. I'm very excited. Okay. Thank you, Michelle. This is a pleasure. We'll do it again next time, all right?
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching College with Mattie. For more information or a coaching session with Mattie, visit collegewithmattie.com. You can follow College with Mattie on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Tune in next week for more episodes, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.